Listen closely because what I'm about to tell you might completely change how you read her silence. Because there is a moment in every man's life when he misreads a woman so badly he walks away from something that was actually leaning toward him. And if you've ever wondered whether she likes you but refuses to show it clearly, you're not alone in that confusion. I'm not here to play guessing games with your emotions. I'm here to give you patterns, real ones, so you stop overthinking every message, every pause, every glance. Because attraction is rarely loud in the beginning, it's subtle. It leaks through behavior long before words ever confirm it. And the men who understand that difference, they never chase blindly. Again, now I want you to picture something very specific. Not what she says to you, but what she does when she thinks you're not paying attention. Because that is where truth lives. Not in text, not in captions, not in the polished version of herself she shows the world. Truth shows up in hesitation, in timing, in repetition, in what she keeps returning to, even when she pretends she's moved on. And if you learn to read those signals correctly, you stop guessing and start knowing. But I need you to be careful here, because once you see these patterns, you cannot unsee them. And that changes how you approach everything. So stay with me, because what you're about to understand isn't opinion, it's behavioral reality. There are three early signs most men completely overlook, not because they are invisible, but because they don't match the fantasy version of interest that movies and social media have trained you to expect. She doesn't always become obvious when she's interested. Sometimes she becomes consistent, sometimes she becomes curious, and sometimes she becomes just a little more present than she used to be. And that consistency is where most men miss the entire story, because they are waiting for intensity while she is offering repetition. Let me slow this down for you. When a woman thinks about you often, it doesn't always look like dramatic behavior. It looks like micro patterns, small choices, repeated engagement, unnecessary reasons to re enter your space. For example, she replies when she doesn't need to. She reacts when silence would be easier. She remembers details that serve no practical purpose except connection. And she does all of this in a way that looks casual on the surface but intentional underneath. That is the part most men dismiss because it doesn't feel like the bold signals they've been taught to look for. But attraction is rarely about boldness in the beginning. It's about repetition that doesn't need explanation. And if you start noticing repetition instead of intensity, your entire understanding of her behavior shifts. And that shift is powerful because it removes confusion and replaces it with clarity you can actually use. But clarity also comes with responsibility, because once you understand what she's really doing, you can no longer lie to yourself about what you're choosing to ignore. And that awareness will follow you into every interaction from this point forward, always remains. Now, I need you to slow your thinking down and listen even more carefully, because this is where most men start convincing themselves they are imagining things. And that's exactly why they stay confused for months, sometimes years. Because the second a woman doesn't show interest in the way they expect, they downgrade everything else she is already showing them. They erase subtlety and then they say, she doesn't like me. But what if she does? Just not in the way you've been trained to recognize. There is a specific shift that happens when you enter a woman's mind in a meaningful way. And no, it's not always emotional confession or direct pursuit. It starts with presence. You begin to show up in her thoughts at random times that don't seem connected to anything logical. She could be doing something completely unrelated, walking, working, scrolling, and your name, your voice, your energy just interrupts her thoughts without permission. And when that happens, she doesn't always tell you. In fact, most of the time, she hides it from everyone, including herself. And here's the part men miss. When someone occupies mental space like that, their behavior bends around it, not dramatically, but subtly. You might notice she engages with your content more than others. You might notice she responds faster at certain times, but not others. You might notice she checks in after periods of silence that feel random to you, but are actually emotional resets for her. That pattern is not coincidence, it's internal repetition leaking outward. But I want to be very clear here. None of this means obsession in the unhealthy sense. Don't confuse emotional imprinting with chaos. A woman thinking about you often doesn't mean she's overwhelmed or unstable. It means you registered. You landed somewhere in her awareness that didn't disappear after the conversation ended. And that is rare enough that most men don't even realize when it happens to them. Now, here is a critical detail. When she is thinking about you frequently, she will often create reasons to interact that don't feel necessary. A random reaction, a delayed message, a question she could have asked anyone, but she asks you. It looks casual, almost accidental, but the underlying pattern is continuity. She is maintaining a thread of connection without openly admitting she wants it. And the biggest mistake men make is underestimating this softness. They assume if it's not direct, it's not real. But emotional interest rarely starts as something direct. It starts as something habitual, something that repeats without effort, something she returns to without planning to. If you can understand that, you stop chasing confusion and start observing structure, because behavior always reveals more than words ever will. And once you see structure instead of noise, you will realize something uncomfortable but powerful. You are not as unsure as you thought. You are just not paying attention to the right signals. There is something even more revealing than her initiating contact, responding quickly, or finding reasons to stay in your orbit. And it's something most men completely miss because it doesn't look like interest at all on the surface. In fact, it often looks like distance. But emotional distance and mental presence are not the same thing, and confusing the two is where men lose clarity. When a woman is thinking about you consistently, you will often see her become slightly inconsistent in how she manages her presence with you. One day she is warm, responsive, and engaged. The next day she is quieter, more reserved, almost as if she pulled back without explanation. And most men interpret that as loss of interest. But what they don't understand is internal processing, because the mind does not stay in one emotional state when something actually matters. It fluctuates, it replays, it evaluates, and that evaluation often looks like distance from the outside. Now, I want you to pay attention to something subtle. She doesn't disappear completely, she doesn't cut the connection, she just regulates it. She steps forward, then steps back. Not because she is playing games, but because her attention is no longer neutral. And once attention is no longer neutral, it becomes self aware. She starts noticing how often she thinks about you. She starts questioning why certain moments remind her of you. And that awareness creates hesitation, and hesitation changes behavior. She might delay replying, not because she doesn't care, but because she is trying to regain emotional balance. She might re engage later with something small, like a reaction or a casual message, as if nothing happened. But what actually happened is internal recalibration. You stayed in her thoughts longer than she expected, and now she's adjusting how much she allows that to show. This is where most men misread the entire situation. They assume consistency means interest and inconsistency means disinterest. But real emotional engagement is rarely perfectly consistent in the early stages. It breathes, it expands and contracts, it moves in waves. And if you only understand surface level behavior, you will always mislabel emotional processing as rejection. There is another detail hidden inside this pattern. When she is mentally engaged, she will often revisit previous interactions with you, not in a dramatic way, but in quiet reflection. Something you said will resurface in her mind at random moments. A joke, a tone, a specific opinion, and she will replay it not because she is trying to analyze you consciously, but because her mind is building familiarity, and familiarity is what creates emotional attachment over time. But here's the part that most men never hear clearly. If you become emotionally significant, you don't stay in her thoughts in a straight line. You echo, you return in fragments, you appear in moments that don't logically connect to you, and that is why she may seem unpredictable predictable from the outside, even though internally she's processing something very consistent. So, when you start seeing slight pullback followed by return, don't rush to label it as confusion or manipulation. Instead, recognize it as attention trying to stabilize itself, because what she feels is no longer just passing awareness. It is something that has started to occupy space, and space in the mind is never neutral for long. Now, I want to take you deeper, because this is where everything becomes more precise and more uncomfortable if you've been misreading situations for a long time. There is a stage where a woman stops simply noticing you and starts orienting around you. And no, that doesn't mean she is chasing you or confessing feelings. It means something far more subtle. Her decisions begin to slightly adjust based on your existence in her mental space. And this is where most men miss the truth completely, because they are still waiting for obvious signals. But real interest at this stage doesn't announce itself. It integrates itself into behavior quietly, indirectly, almost invisibly. You might notice she starts remembering things about you without effort, things you only mentioned once, details you forgot you even shared, and yet she brings them up later in a way that feels natural to her, not rehearsed. That is not random memory, that is emotional prioritization. Because the brain does not store everything equally, it stores what it repeatedly returns to. Now, here's something even more important. She begins to create small windows for interaction, not obvious invitations, not dramatic gestures, but timing based openings. She appears online when you're likely to be active. She responds more often during specific hours. She leaves space in conversations instead of fully closing them. And these patterns are not about coincidence, they are about availability alignment. Her behavior starts subtly syncing with your presence. But let me be clear, this is not manipulation. This is how attention naturally organizes itself when someone becomes psychologically relevant. People adjust around what occupies their thoughts. Sometimes they don't even realize they're doing it. And there is another layer here that most men completely overlook. She may begin referencing shared emotional context more often, not necessarily deep confessions, but reminders of shared moments, a joke you both laughed at, a past conversation, a small connection point. And the reason she does this is simple. Emotional anchors reduce internal uncertainty. When someone is thinking about you often, the mind looks for grounding points to stabilize that feeling. But here's where misunderstanding happens. Men expect intensity, they expect dramatic escalation. But at this stage, the real signal is continuity. You are no longer being experienced as a random interaction. You are becoming part of her mental background process, and that does not feel loud from the outside. It feels like repetition, familiarity, and re engagement that doesn't require explanation. And if you pay attention closely, you'll notice something even more revealing. She rarely fully resets with you. Even after silence, even after distance, she returns with familiarity still intact. No complete emotional reset, no full detachment, just continuation from where things emotionally left off. That is not casual behavior anymore. That is a pattern of retention, and once someone is retained in that way, they don't disappear from thought easily. They resurface. They re enter conversations mentally before they ever re enter them physically. And most importantly, they begin to matter in decisions that have nothing to do with you on the surface, but everything to do with how much space you now occupy inside her awareness. At this point, you need to understand something. Most men never get clearly explained when a woman is thinking about you consistently. The real signs stop looking like pursuit and start looking like restraint. Not because she is holding back interest, but because she is becoming aware of it. And awareness changes everything. Because the moment someone realizes they are mentally returning to you more than expected, they don't always move closer immediately. Sometimes they pause, they observe themselves, they test their own reactions, and from the outside, that can look like mixed signals. But internally, it is evaluation, not of you, but of what you are doing to their attention. And here is the part that changes how you see see everything. She may begin to act slightly more controlled in your presence, not colder, not distant, controlled. She becomes more aware of how she responds, how quickly she replies, how much energy she gives in certain moments. And that control is not rejection, it is awareness of emotional exposure. Because when someone starts thinking about you often, they don't just feel connection, they start noticing the connection. And once something is noticed, it can no longer stay fully automatic. It becomes something she manages. Now pay attention to this detail. She may still initiate contact, but with a slightly different tone, less chaotic, more intentional. Short messages that still carry weight, replies that feel measured. Not because interest is fading, but because she is now conscious of how often she is engaging. And that consciousness creates moderation. But here's what most men misunderstand: moderation is not absence, it is regulation. And regulation only happens when something exists strongly enough to require control. Another important sign appears in how she responds to your silence. If she is not thinking about you, your absence creates nothing, no reaction, no shift. But when she is thinking about you, often silence does not disappear, it echoes. She notices gaps, she becomes aware of missing interaction, and sometimes she responds to that gap indirectly by reappearing with something small, casual, almost unrelated. Not because she planned a dramatic return, but because your absence became noticeable in her mental rhythm. And here is something very few men understand: emotional presence does not always demand constant contact, it demands mental return. If she keeps returning to you in thought, she will eventually return to you in behavior. But the timing is never predictable because it is not driven by logic, it is driven by internal pacing. She is not responding to a schedule, she is responding to a feeling that keeps resurfacing in quiet moments when there is nothing else competing for attention. And that is why you can never fully understand this process by looking at single messages or isolated moments. You have to look at patterns over time: repetition, return, regulation, and re engagement. Because when all of those begin to appear together, something very simple is happening underneath all the complexity. You are no longer just someone she knows, you are someone she revisits, and that difference is where everything changes. Now, listen to me carefully, because this is where everything you've learned either becomes clarity or stays as confusion you keep repeating in your head. There is a final stage most men never recognize while it's happening, and it's the stage where you are no longer being processed in her mind. You are being mentally integrated into it, not as an obsession, not as a fantasy, but as a reference point, a pattern, a familiar presence her thoughts naturally return to without instruction. And when that happens, the signs stop looking like traditional attraction entirely. She doesn't need to constantly talk to you to think about you. In fact, some of the strongest mental presence happens in silence, because silence removes distraction. And when distraction disappears, whatever is emotionally relevant rises to the surface without permission. So you may notice something strange. She reaches out at unexpected times, not necessarily to start something deep, but to reset a connection she already feels internally. A simple message, a reaction, a short comment that doesn't fully explain itself. And most men misinterpret this as randomness, but it is not randomness. It is continuation, because when someone occupies mental space, the mind tries to maintain connection in small ways even when life gets busy. It's not always romantic, it's psychological familiarity. Your presence becomes part of her internal environment, like a thought that returns when things get quiet. And here is something very important you need to understand. If a woman is thinking about you often, she does not experience it as constant awareness. She experiences it as moments, sudden reminders, emotional flashes, something she hears, something she sees, something she feels, and your name or presence briefly appears in that moment. That is how mental repetition works. It doesn't stay loud, it returns in intervals. Now, at this stage, she may also begin to subtly test emotional safety, not in obvious ways, but in behavioral signals. She might open slightly more personal conversations. She might share something a bit more real than usual, not necessarily deep vulnerability, but enough to see how you respond. Because when someone is mentally present in your life, they begin to wonder what emotional space they actually hold there. And this is where your reaction matters more than anything else. If you chase intensity, you often misread stability. If you demand clarity too soon, you interrupt natural emotional development. And if you overanalyze every small signal, you destroy the very pattern you are trying to understand. Because the truth is, when someone is thinking about you consistently, the most powerful indicator is not one message or one moment. It is continuity without effort. You don't force it, you observe it. And now I want to bring you back to something you might have overlooked from the beginning. Every sign I've described doesn't exist in isolation. It exists in repetition. It builds slowly. It accumulates over time. And the men who recognize it early don't do so because they are guessing correctly. They do so because they are watching behavior instead of chasing confirmation. But there is one final truth you need to hear clearly. Even if she is thinking about you often, even if you are occupying her mind more than you realize, that does not automatically guarantee action. Thinking is not the same as choosing. Awareness is not the same as movement. And emotional presence is not the same as decision. This is where emotional maturity becomes more important than interpretation, because your goal should never be to decode her mind so you can obsess over it. Your goal is to understand patterns so you stop losing yourself in uncertainty. You don't need to overanalyze every silence or every message. You need to recognize when a pattern is forming and when it is not. And if there is one thing I want you to take from everything we've talked about, it's this. If she never thinks about you twice, you will feel it. But if she does, you will also feel it. The difference is whether you are paying attention to patterns or chasing reassurance. Now, I want you to be honest with yourself. What confuses you more right now? What she is doing or what you hope it means? Write your answer in the comments. And if this made you see things differently, like the video, subscribe, and share it with a friend who still thinks silence always means disinterest.